I wanted to thank you all for being in conversation today. And when we started this grant, I have to say, one of the ideas back then was to think about very straightforwardly the relationship of image, text, and context. We came to a point where there were various sort of imaginative exponents around image making and production. And while those existed, I think we were trying to root it in a way to a practice associated with the artist. We were trying to root it also to just the culture of emerging photo books at the time. And as all of you all know, this was seen either through festivals in and outside India or through exhibitionary modes, very often, albeit briefly, through discussions. I think there was a certain point of arrival. And with that arrival came its own scales of economy. And this is one of the things I found fascinating about books coming out over the last 10 years is, as all of you all know again, the move towards self-publishing. Some of you all do that already, so you know well about it. But I was interested to know more about scales of economy on the one hand, what they represented and who they were reaching to, and what sort of audience generation this was going to encounter, and whether it had an eye to certain displacements as well. After all, modes of accessibility exist around reading images. And I think part of the intention of these conversations has been to think about different ways in which we encounter books. We might read them, and also we might see them not only as objects of course, a certain pedagogy and practice, but of entertainment, of leisure. After all, books were also meant to be objects through which one could sort of, branch beyond the threshold of just study. Another uniqueness that came with the photo book very often was the idea of a collaboration. And so many of the publications that many of you all have done have been these collaboratory molds, have arrived at not only through the book format, but other projects that have suddenly taken the shape, size, and form of a different kind of publication. So can we say that a book is a kind of atlas of lived time? I was interested in a question like that. And if it was so, what kind of narratives is it presenting to us? But at the same time, one is dealing with forms and formats. Some of those forms and formats have to do with non-linearity. Some of them have to do with a collapsing meaning from the image. And a lot of it has to do with bringing together what is invisible, what is not actually there into focus by threading it together into a storyline. All of these things became sort of points of exit and entry into what the photo book is today, what it means for you all individually. And in a way, I was interested in asking you all because I think the provocations for all of you all are different, even though they are working with books. I think you'll come from different places, different practices, but somehow the book is relevant and important to you. And especially at this point of time, and I'm thinking very directly at this point of time, as everyone has had to, what can be the future of a photo book? Not that we need sort of a solution to arrive at, but just to think about where we are. I wanted to get a sense of what you thought about this, day and age, changed as it has since 2019, for time to come, I would say. What I'm also trying to get to is, and this has been a longer discussion with many of you, is how do micro-histories get put across today? How do we use so-called micro-political moments and social histories in order to make community imperatives? And Nihal, if you don't mind, can you start off with your work, Reliable Copy, and where you find yourself today?
I'm presenting one work, a memorial for the new economy by Chinar Shah, that Reliable Copy published in 2019. Maybe to start with, I'll read the artist's note about the project. On the 8th of November 2016, the government of India demonetized all circulating 500 and 1,000 rupee banknotes without warning. This move suddenly invalidated these notes, deeming them unusable in exchange for any goods or service. Instantly, India's heavily cash dependent economy found itself in an unstable position. In the months following this announcement, over 100 people died as a consequence. As a society, we quickly memorialized the consequences of human conflict, natural disasters, and even of random acts of violence, but financial collapses and its human toll are often ignored or rendered invisible. Within this context, a memorial for the new economy proposes a publication as a memorial, one that is neither a grand proclamation nor a fixed monument, but instead a document dependent on systems of distribution, access, and exchange. So the publication took this form. It's a series of 121 photographs. They're all of handkerchiefs, and each one is embroidered with a name, as well as a motif that's actually a part of the 500 and 1000 rupee notes that was declared invalid, like the triangular part you see here, or this kind of motif around Abhijit, or these little like horns on either side. So, kind of deconstructing the banknotes and elements from there and bringing it into these handkerchiefs, and also embroidering the names of people that died as a result of demonetization. And this comes from a large compilation of news articles around the subject, collected over many, many months. And this is the publication. And the photo book functions as a portable memorial, an index of history and violence. So, for instance, here you can see the logo for the 1000 that's on the side of the note, the floral thing that kind of shows you the 1000 when read from both sides. So, how we published this is actually the main thing. How we published it was we published it on our website as a freely downloadable zip folder. When you download it, you get 121 JPEG files and a PDF with a kind of text about the work. It's not bound in any way, it's not kind of ordered in any way. The names are as the photographer's files, IMG so and so number, and it's 121, 120 names she found, and then there was one blank without any name for all the kind of unnoted victims. So the premise was to consider a photo book as a digital document, a zip folder and a collection of JPEG files. So we published it on our website. You can download it in two editions. There's a 200 MB file and a 500 MB version. And that was it. And it's also registered as a copyleft publication. So it's free, anyone can reuse it, anyone can modify it, anyone can recirculate it, but as long as it's not for any commercial use. Now, the project itself kind of determined the form, because when we were conceptualizing this project, initially we wanted to make a book, but then it started to make less and less sense, because to get a good quality photo print of this kind would make the book very expensive, and then you can't start selling an expensive book about demonetization. It just made no sense. So finally, we decided, okay, maybe it should be in a pen drive. Then finally, we said, no, forget it. We just put it online. Whoever wants to download it can download it. And that became the form of it. So, kind of the context determined the form, and the scale of economy determined the form, and the modes of accessibility, as you pointed out, Rahab.
Mhm.
Where this way it became accessible, maybe not to everyone, because I mean, there's still inequalities to internet access and all of that, inequalities to even finding this website, but still, for whoever looks, it's there. And this is how it comes when you download it. You get all the kind of images. If you download the 500 MB version, you can even print them out. They're really good quality. And something about production is that it was photographed at Navjeevan Trust, which was a trust Gandhi set up in the 1930s to publish his writings in Gujarat. And we hired a few embroiderers locally to help Chinar stitch them. What happens is, after we published it, it became a kind of performative object, one in translation. So, for instance, Printed Matter wanted to host it as a digital download on their website, but they couldn't host zip files. So then we made it into a PDF to fit their format. So then the PDF starts with the kind of text page and the colophon, and then starts with the images. And then recently, Asia Art Archive wanted to kind of archive this as one of their documents. So they also use the PDF format. So that became how it kind of transformed into another kind of object, another kind of document. This is more about its exhibition context, a photo book unbound and a photo book unhooked. It was shown at View India. This was the first exhibition it was featured in. It was in Sweden, and Rahab also had the chance to visit and be part of this show. Here it was shown as a wallpaper. So all the images were kind of brought together as a wallpaper and then presented in this way. The important thing about the work is it's still an artwork, it's still a series of photographs, as much as it is a photo book. So, as a series of photographs published in this way, where you have access to all the JPEG files, it's a curatorial decision of how to present it. There is no right way as such. There is no pre-formatted or pre-decided way. So here it became a wallpaper. We launched it at home at a private kind of gathering with close friends, and we showed it just as a grid on the wall, where each picture is kind of hanging by itself. But equally valid is to show it as a slideshow or on a computer screen or even as a kind of tearaway poster. These were all ideas that were supposed to materialize this year in exhibitions, but they all got cancelled.
Well, thank you, Nehal, for sharing that particular body of work. What strikes me immediately is, as you intimated, it sort of presents to me at least one thread through which we might think about the documentary right now, where that is going and how that is led to. And what sort of an aestheticization of this moment, and also bringing it together within different viewerships and different viewing modalities is what you're really talking about, does to the idea of a certain seriality that the book presents, perhaps. Even that is seeing all of them together as like one image in itself. And so it gives you the very thrust of the sheer surfeit of the problem, if you could call it that, and scale at which it's going slowly manifesting over a period of time. Can I ask you, Alicia, to talk about a lot of the work that you have done in Kashmir with the collective comes into some form of thought when we get into the representational politics of our moment. And of course, it does through what one might call just on, offhandedly kind of an archive. And I know that you've done some talks on this idea of the borrowed archive. And I'm so interested in this because your work brings it down to people and individuals in a very, very direct way, and how one reads their lives and their times, but think about the consequences of history unraveling in our present to a great extent.
I decided not to prepare a PowerPoint and present a more sort of personal series of notes and anecdotes around my time and thinking with photo books over the last sort of 10 years, because they played a very pivotal role in my choosing to become a photographer, and then my also choosing to no longer call myself a photographer. And I think it might be interesting to trace that journey and then address more specifically the kind of questions that I posed in my abstract around the real difficulty of being with a photo book today. For most of the last year, even before the pandemic, I have been thinking heavily about, very similar to a lot of what Nihal just talked about with regards to accessibility, modalities of viewing, new digital infrastructures, right? New digital infrastructures, both online and within the space of the exhibition. But I have also been shifting a lot of my kind of time towards thinking about the role of photographs in kind of shorter video works and shorter films, because Radhi and I worked together on a short film called Watch Night. In Watch Night, we used a series of archival photographs that Radhi had found in not very well known archive to illustrate how this ritual that this short documentary was sort of talking about, which takes place in the Low Country in America only in Black churches on New Year's Eve, to kind of celebrate the coming of the Emancipation Proclamation. How could we bring to light the very sort of dark history that had preceded it, and how long and important this tradition had been, right? So both within my work with Kashmir Photo Collective and then kind of starting to work as a producer and with Radhi, I have been focused very much on thinking about archival photographs and kind of various digital spaces within which they can be kind of fused to bring out certain long-term political resonances. And that was not the case, when I was like 21 and spending hours and hours and hours and even in the many years after that, when I was I would say totally immersed in this community of photographers who we were looking at photo books together. I was looking at photo books alone. We were constantly, there were photographers at home with piles of images, talking about edits, many dummy books. Philippe knows this very well. In Bombay, many conversations around the book which have taken place. And so when I was asked to do this talk, I posed those three questions, around, can I guess, and even though I posed them in the we, I was really asking myself, like, can I really retrieve what feels like this very arcane pleasure of viewing the photo book, given everything that we are living through right now? And there is a lot of grief. I have, unfortunately, people very close to me within my family, within my friendships and relatives who've been touched by the pandemic. What is the space of the photo book when we are living through so much grief? And so can we look at these photo books, or should we try to look at photo books unburdened by the social optics of the present? And then the third question that I was asking myself was, if I was to try and harness, to create a photo book right now, what form would it need to take? There has never been a successful theoretical architecture around editing, right? We've never been able to successfully create enough language to break down the practice of editing, to kind of analyze it in the way we do other types of semiotic work. And the reason for that is obviously that it's an act which consistently evades theory, right? And so, but I think when I see the conversation around editing taking place today, one of the things that I see getting very confused is the algorithmic editing that the internet is doing for us in the kind of images it serves to us, versus the kind of editing we sit and physically engage with when we are working as professionals. And I think when we enter the conversation about editing in this talk, it'll be interesting to try and make sure we pull that apart.
Well, thank you, Alicia, because that sort of, I think, sets the stage for, in many ways, another question that is always presented as a book presents itself and is released is, what are the institutional, para-institutional moments that led to its arrival? As you talked about the artifactual mode, one of the things that, of course, comes to my mind is the work that Philippe has also been doing for so long, going to museums throughout the country and sort of creating interesting modes of spectatorship and viewership. At least that's what it strikes me as. And this question of the museumizing of any object, which the photo book has also undergone to a great extent, makes us question actually the role of macro, mainstream, dominant narratives. Once again, a project that has been done by Bind as Bodyguard Lane, all of us have seen it, I suppose, at some point of time, made one ask that question about the relationship to subject, what that brings together when one is weaving together a photo book or any kind of narrative, what one leaves out, what one puts in, who decides. And so with that, if I may ask Mr. Kalia to dwell upon some of the work that he has been doing with Bind, which I feel will never be closed as an entity. It will live on well beyond its current temporary cessation, and will come together in different ways and with different projects. So just with that in mind, as practitioner and publisher and librarian, if you can lead us to your presentation.
I would organize my talk around three moments. The idea of the paradigm shift that the photo book represented in my practice, then speak a bit more about the Bind initiative in particular, and then some of my experiments with the book form. So I was going back to painting a lot, and still even in the work that I do on museums, like this is a practice that has actually been haunting me for a while. But why was I choosing this image is because it's kind of an epitome of what is known as the peripeteia. So this jargon Greek term, that qualifies this reversal, basically this moment where the narrative like shifts, and how like this kind of narrative model has like influenced photography greatly, as we know through the idea mostly of the decisive moment taken by Cartier-Bresson in Indonesia in 1949, when the day before independence, when they are removing the portraits of the Dutch rulers from the governor's palace. Mm-hmm. So an epitome of the decisive moment in photography. And then I was also using this photograph of Raghuveer Singh that we are all familiar with to remind us that the decisive moment was not only, in terms of like narrative, but also in terms of composition. And, again, using this Fibonacci circle that comes from painting, for us to understand photography. But of course, things are not as black and white, because as we can consider, with these two photographers like Raghuveer Singh and Bresson, who are like sort of torchbearers of the decisive moment, they are also great bookmakers in a sense, and so it's not like a clear divide about photographer that would be like completely on the side of like the single image versus someone who would be like on the side of a series of images that can be put in a narrative and under the form of a book. Interestingly, was a kind of freedom from this, what you could call a tyranny of the single image, and this possibility for the value of an image to stem from its relation to the other images and not just for its own sake. It's also a freedom that was in a sense like institutional, because suddenly like also the photograph was not to be understood, on the wall as a painting, in a frame. There was also this possibility to make an integral piece of work, a consistent piece of work, and share it with the public without necessarily having the support of the gallery or the museum and logistical costs that all of this implies, which is why I was also referring to this book that Anurag Banerjee self-published last year. What I found really interesting about it, besides the work itself, was the way it was made, which was like just with a Xerox machine and a pair of scissors and glue, and he just made 50 copies, but there was this spontaneity of it, which was quite interesting. I was also referring to Paul Graham quite a bit. He's an artist that has been influencing me quite a lot, and it was interesting to understand its own practice, under this paradigmatic shift, because there's this groundbreaking book called Shimmer of Possibility, where it's a collection of 12 different moments, each put into a book. So by moments, I mean like he's taking a moment of daily life and he's taking several pictures, almost like movie stills, and putting them under a book. And so he made quite an unusual object, but the primary object is the book, and this is how we all discovered it. And it was interesting to see after that, like how it was put into different kind of spaces. So just to put it in a nutshell, it was interesting to have a vision where the book became the primary form. The main realization was that a model where the book becomes the central work, and then you have possible manifestations of it into the space. And I think this is one idea that not really consciously, like we also explored during the Delhi Photo Festival in 2015, so soon after we had started the library, where we picked up one big book we had been given, which we found like really beautiful and special, and we wanted to share this one only. In this case is that we took this one book, and which was composed of like 8 different journals that Max Pam had done. It's a book called Atlas Monographs, published by an Australian publisher. And what we would do is every day we would paste one of the chapters on the wall during the whole festival, which was like, around 8 days as well. And mostly this process of like playing with the images themselves, pasting them on top of each other, and somewhat like incarnating into a space what was happening at a mental level of like, the superimposition of images, overlaying sedimentation of memory. So that's like, according to this model of like expanding the book into space. That's the state of the Bind library before like the apocalypse. So basically like we had finally reopened in Bandra, where like Trilogy bookstore and library had shifted. But then, like basically now like all of us at different points in our lives and also different parts of the world, few of us, there's only like Sunil and Andrea that are left in Bombay. And finally, the library has been taken over by Kamna and Jojo Books. One of the main legacy of Bind is to have left this collection of about like 250 books, which is a resource, for students, for researchers. I just wanted to talk about this one book, for instance, which is a children's book, which has really influenced my own research and practice. And so how, again, it is important for me, like to see books and photo books alongside others. It's a book that works on the transparency of the paper. And this is something that I have explored myself on my work with on museums, which you can see here. Again, the relationship to painting, but this time put on the format of a book. So it's a continuation of that questioning of mine. This is a photograph. This was a vector drawing before. And this, of course, like is the Bodyguard Lane album that I think, what I wanted to say about it was an experiment in a sense, it was also a social experiment. There was a desire, I think, to make a kind of memorial, like in the same way also that Nihal, wanted to make something about demonetization. In this case, it was about like leaving a trace, a tangible trace, about the existence of these families in a certain street in Bombay. And I wanted to say how maybe like 1984 by Gorigil was an influence in that sense, because it was also like a photo book that was printed in Xerox that I had seen in several exhibitions. It was also available as a PDF. So the mode of circulation was also interesting for the Bodyguard Lane album. Eventually, it is also an invitation for us to think of different formats, think of different modes of distribution. Again, not get too enchanted by the prettiness and the beauty and of the design of photo books and the photo book, by getting away from the formalism of painting, in a sense, like got into the formalism of the design of the book, which is also a risk for me. Last remark, I just realized while I was making this talk that you would call such book like 1984 a pamphlet because it is an unbound publication. But when I grew up in France and my knowledge of the word pamphlet is actually a literary genre. It's a pamphlet is a criticism of institutions. Like it was notably used by Voltaire, when he was criticizing monarchy and Catholicism. So it was a very virulent criticism, it was a political charge basically, and very harsh one. And so it's interesting to see, like in this case, how the term embodies the format as well as the content. And I think also that should make us think about like how these two are interdependent and intertwined with each other.
Well, thanks, Philippe, for that presentation. I mean, it sort of definitely brings to light the idea of pamphleteering, which is, of course, associated deeply with all modes of resistance, and especially when, I guess, collectives of people and organizations are atomized, then that is exactly where this comes through. And of course, France has a great history of, I also feel, where the university plays a very strong role through that act of pamphleteering in order to, support leftist social movements more generally. It's a very strong trajectory. And the other quick reflection that I had was, as you brought up Cartier-Bresson, I believe when his book first came out, it was never titled The Decisive Moment, but actually loosely translated as Images Taken on the Sly. And that's quite a thing, is what happens down the road, because he was such a philosopher as much as he was, a photographer, as you well know. It's interesting that the message of his entire trajectory has changed as a consequence, and this is exactly what books can do. In France, it had a particular title. When it became English, it changed entirely. I'm also going to use that to sort of get on to our last presentation, which is by Anshika. And one of the refrains I was coming to was, as you indicated, Alicia, and you indicated, Nihal, and so did Philippe, is media, as I've been reading it. The work that you're doing now, Anshika, is to think about the consequences of various modes of production in a sense. Mm-hmm. And of course, photography and photo books is something that you focus on immensely. And I'm assuming that that's also the case because one is dealing so closely with the idea of a binary. On the one hand, there's a great force towards what is produced locally, what is produced regionally, and then, of course, transnational histories that can be taken as metaphors from that. And I think that's a very significant underlying quality to so many of the books that I've been looking at. And I suppose a lot of what you're looking at, not only as a bookmaker and as an author in yourself, but also as a kind of provoker of conversations around this, is that there is a cultural moment in, let's say, even South Asia that is happening, which is something that you've been looking at. And I'm curious to know from you where those discussions are actually leading you to, because South Asia itself becomes so problematic when one leaves South Asia or when you get diasporic conversations into the mix. How does one affiliate to this imaginary place?
Thanks for that, Rahab. A lot has been said, and it's been very interesting to kind of listen to varied perspectives on the book, some that have made me, have brought up many questions I'm sure we're going to discuss over here. I actually thought I would talk about the book from different points of view also, because I am a photographer and I am someone who is experimenting with how one can work with books. And I think in that process of trying to finalize my dummy, it's kind of taken me into this different world almost. And now I'm just in the midst of that. And there's a lot of questions that have come up, a lot of learning and a lot of listening actually that has allowed me to kind of think about maybe photography and the book as separate from each other as well in many ways. Mm-hmm. And I think for me that was very important, because I think when the book just becomes about the photography, I feel like we're kind of trying to work between two different languages and two different mediums. And so I started to look at the book as a separate language itself, as a separate medium in itself. And I think that has kind of brought me to certain experiments with my own work, and in many ways even the creation of Offset, which happened just a couple of years ago. And this was also happening at a time when I was working on a dummy of my own, something that I'm still kind of trying to make sense of. And I think that really got me to question how we define the photo book. What does it mean if I say that I'm coming out with this photo book? Like, what does it mean? And why do I have to call it a photo book and not a book? Is there something very specifically different that I intend for that object to do that I might not want a book to do? And I think at that point for me, like the question was really, what is the intention of the person who's making that book? And I think that's where the interest came into the intention of the author, the intention of the publisher. It's interesting to also think about what becomes the book. It's something that Nihal and I spoke about very briefly at one point, where we were like, is a catalog a book, or is something downloadable a book? And I don't know where I do stand on it largely, but I think they're all acts of publishing in some way, right? And each of them has their own intentions. Each of them has their own impact. For the creation of this particular dummy that I did work on, it was, it's a work that actually did, emerge from a grant and also a curation that Rahab, you were a part of. So this was actually the exhibition that, we had put up of the work. It was about the Delhi Ridge, and it's about my history with this particular forest and my memories with it, and also the idea of childhood that was kind of getting lost in me and in the landscape at the same time. In the process of making this work, a lot of foraging kind of encountered, and the book seemed like it could be a part of the work. And when I say that, I mean that very often we feel that the book has to be the culmination of a work. It has to be the end of a long project that you do have. And I don't think it needs to be like that. For me, it is in the same way that I would have foraged objects, I would have photography. I built these terrariums. The book was a part of that work. It offered a perspective that could be contained within that object, within that medium, within that narrative. What became important was what I wanted to do with the work, what I wanted to say with the work, and not the formation of it as a book or as an exhibition or as an Instagram page or, multiple other formats. And a lot of, I think, the interventions that I had done during the exhibition, we'd also had a gallery walk where we brought in people and I kind of asked them to share their memories on paper, and some people drew, some people wrote, some people sang. For me, it was that collective feeling that could come inside this object. So I don't know if it is a photo book, I don't know if it is a diary, I don't know if it is documentation of material and memory, but I don't know if it has to be just one of them either. With particular works like Hal Muridada, this is a dummy book. It becomes like an act of listening, and it allows the author to engage and express that act of listening just by this repetitive testimonies that run one after the other, after the other, after the other. And by the end of it, you arrive at that space of exhaustion and yet realize that there has been absolutely no respite, no resolution for victims of the 84 riots. Hari's work, where Hari and Shweta are a couple and they've made this work together. And for me, this book is kind of a process of therapy. It's a process of getting to know each other. It's a process where he takes these images, his wife looks at it, and she says, you don't know how to photograph me, and I want my own agency in how I'm seen. And she kind of pretty much takes this book from him. She takes that authorship from him and imposes herself and puts herself in that place and co-authors it. She places material she wants, she puts in text that she's wants to talk about. And it becomes in many ways a journey for the both of them to come together, and to also find themselves in the midst of this new city that they had arrived at. Sanjeev says happy good night. Why I want to show them is because over here, the publisher, the collaboration is more of the author with their own object. Like while we are talking about editing exercises, I always look at Adil's and Abawazil as an amazing exercise in editing. How there are two books contained within this one, where the editor, who's also Sanjeev Seth, has managed to bring us the mindscape and the chaos of a son trying to make sense of the world around him while his father has been diagnosed with cancer, and yet protecting his father within the gatefold. So if you look at this book without opening these gatefolds, it's a story about the son. And if you look at this book with the gatefolds open, it's a story about the father. Similarly, you have Yu from Burma, who's kind of trying to make sense of heartbreak, but really using the book as therapy. That's what it offers. And these, I don't know if they need to be final acts of published books, but they are archives of how people and photographers and artists and what they're going through, what their concerns are right now. Sadia's Days Untitled is also a dummy that looks at the 21 days, if I'm not mistaken, where her parents kind of forced her into a psychiatric institution because they felt that she needed that. And how is she making sense of that? So Richard Dwivedi is also working on this dummy that's actually emerged out of the quarantine, which I find extremely fascinating. It's about a relationship that's developed over a Skype call, and it goes through seasons, and it goes through days, and it goes through monotony. But it's very interesting that something that actually happened on this virtual format for him to accept it in his life, he has to have it in a tangible form still in his hands. All of these actually were acts of reading that I learned about and I try to share about with Offset.
Thank you. It's thinking and reading about or reading through with these images, but in a way, are there modes of communication that the photo book is withholding and is sort of preempting in an era where, as Alicia suggested, it's something going out of certain fashion in the sense that you're not sitting with a book, you're sitting with a tablet, and what we're suggesting is that actually it doesn't matter what form a photo book no longer takes. It can be an e-book after all. It doesn't need to be printed matter. But my own understanding then is that the initiatives like Bind, for instance, that was creating a library where you go and you sit and you actually manage to do that, has an experiential quality of its own. Now, I suppose they don't need to be binaries. You can have one or the other. It doesn't really need to become a contentious discussion about where we go and how we do things. At this point of time, I'm thinking about how do you map the impact of this journey through the book while we are dealing with neoliberalism, to a great extent, demonetization, those ideas, while we are dealing with a kind of a political intensification through various non-related objects. And while this book can become so much more than a personal testimony, but really about personal testimonies across the board, in a way, this is exactly the problematic maybe that one is in, is that how do you look at the book for what it is, create a publication that has, all of these discursive elements coming in from time to time, but also read them as testaments of the here and the now. Is that going to be possible for us? And so maybe just a line or two about the here and now would be interesting from all of you based on this discussion.
I'm trying to also keep in mind the format of the album and wondering where's today's album, because I think Alicia was pointing out also earlier that the fact that the editing today is happening through algorithm. Actually, for our family albums, like more and more of the photos, we take them digitally. It's difficult to separate, like our practice as artists sometimes from the photographs we take, like at an intimate level. And because you were talking also about like how you see like a lot of these like diary sorts of publication emerging more and more as a genre. I don't know, I feel like there's a desire to bring order into the chaos at some point, to pause, to print, to breathe, and to tell a story with all this like that you have not taken. But I think this moment of reordering the chaos is also crucial, And then after that, one virtue for me of the album is that that moment of community. I mean, an album is something you can look with a certain sense of nostalgia, but it's often also something where people gather around and have discussion and share stories. So it's also like it's also a tool, like it becomes a means also for like social interactions and actually like social link and community. And so in that sense, like it has a potential to break away from the little like solitary node of the digital world in that sense. So I think it has like definitely has a scope, if I can say so.
I found both Anshika's presentation, especially the last part of it, was very moving in how she framed, the books that she was showing as therapeutic objects and like objects that are building and undoing and unraveling relationships. And when you ask that question right after about, why is it that people are choosing to synthesize within the book form their personal experience as enmeshed with the world, I think the answer that has come to me, and particularly after making the shift recently from Bombay, Goa here to South Carolina, one of the things that has remained consistent is that it is so difficult to find within the kind of mainstream discourse of media and like the daily news or the most widespread, like, we always talk about photography in the realm of mass reproduction, and it has this whole weight of the picture magazine, etc. With it, there is imagery that is connecting us and also disconnecting us all consistently, if that makes sense. So it's very hard to find a shared space where you see yourself being visually reproduced, and what you're experiencing politically being visually reproduced, that is happening especially in the culture of daily print, right? And because the churn of images is so quick on a daily basis. So if your way of getting visual news or even getting therapeutic space or a community space is now happening over WhatsApp or is now happening over Instagram, right? That is also a space that is charged with so much other kind of visual messaging, so much commercial neoliberal emphasis, right? And for people who study and think about visuals constantly, I think all of us can agree that it's really astonishing to see the speed with which, a week before you may have seen an image or someone kind of make a visual statement that seemed really fresh and really responsive, and how within the next 6 or 7 days that starts to feel old. It starts to feel like it's already been ripped apart by the market, by the forces that kind of rule the mainstream sort of screaming voices of the day. And that is both within our community of art and photography, as well as the kind of visuals that are circulating outside of our community, right? So perhaps one of the reasons why people are choosing to have this very personal synthesis that we see occurring from all different parts of the region within the book is because where else can you go? And that could be one answer to that question, because the vultures of the internet or the vultures of social media, as soon as you make that same visual presence available in the digital format, right? And I work with the digital archive, so I'm not saying that there's no space for new media and all of that, and I'm not just trying to be a naysayer, but there is a certain way that it is consumed. And I'm not saying in terms of consumption, but like literally eaten, shat out, regurgitated, like back at you, and with a force and a speed which can be quite terrifying. So Anshika's, the book she showed at the end really made me think that it's a need that is being responded to.
Mm-hmm.
I got completely caught on to how Alicia in her presentation used the word artifact as opposed to document. And I kept thinking about that. I mean, this could be a silly terminology problem, but when Anshika showed her work with the plants and the trees, I said, okay, that's artifact, that's not document. I mean, I would love to discuss that more. I would love to discuss Philippe's Memorial Bodyguard Lane project and understand more about that. But I think I'll keep it simple to kind of come to your question, Rahab, the primary one that you want us to summarize. And I guess I'll echo my own presentation, which is that the photo book, perhaps we can imagine it not as an inert object, but one that is performative. So in the case of the project I presented, you download it. The minute you download it, you own it. It's on your desktop, it's on your computer. It becomes one of your files. And once you have the file, you can reorder it, you can modify it, you can print it, you can distort it, and you can email it, you can share it. And I guess this also ties into Anshika's therapeutic object, where the act of therapy, the act of engagement might not be just of the maker, but also of the reader. Maybe a photo book that allows the space for that is another proposition that we can consider.
Within the dynamic of these being personal diaries or these processes of healing or therapy, I also find them as very strong acts of resistance in many ways. And I feel that the format of the personal diary can very often do that. It's something that's in fact very reflective of where we are today as a society, how we do approach the politics. The personal is the political today, more than I think at any other time that I have witnessed, at least, in my life. And so this act of making these books that are actually more introspective, for me, they really reflect what we are going through. The need to understand who we are, the need to kind of know our motivations. And I feel when we find that core that's kind of holding us and that work together as authors. I haven't really published a book, so I can't speak as much about dissemination and the economies of it as Philippe or Nihal might. But we recently started a bookshop at Offset. We are creating these volumes of thoughts and these volumes of questions. But is there an echo to it? And the response to it has been immense. And I just wanted to say, I do realize that there are various acts of publication. There is of course downloadable files, there is ebooks, there's Instagram. I feel like that demand of the book, that it's expectation that you have to be engaged with it. You have to cut out that noise from everywhere else. It's very difficult to find that in an online format for me right now. At the same time, you have a book like Monsanto that actually needed to be disseminated in a particular format, and Matthew Asselin did that. So I don't think there has to be any one particular format of the book. It has to be what the intention of the work is. It has to be what the work demands it to be, whether it's an artifact, whether it's a downloadable file, whether it's an object or a sculptural form of the book even, which is something that many artists are even experimenting with today. And I think that is what's interesting about it, to know that literature does not have one language, photography does not have one language. And so the question really is, how far can we bring ourselves to engage with what we are creating and the language that it demands from us, rather than us knowing whether it has to be a book. The Dalit book is something that I'm so grateful. It's this big hardbound book that almost it demands to be written as a historical record. If it was something that was downloadable, it would have had a completely different impact. But I understand the intention of it just by the way that it falls in my hand. Witness does the same thing. And I think because we do not have very fixed economic formats, in South Asia, it's very freeing in many ways, because we don't have to fit to these categories. We can mix it up and we can create something completely different from it.
Thanks for that. Maybe the next sort of time one engages with this question, as all of you have intimated, is this very question of virality. How does one actually deal with levels of readability in an extremely, on the one hand, disenfranchising moment, but also a very empowering moment at the same time? I mean, we've understood only too soon that there is, the fourth estate does not come without its gatekeepers. How do you actually deal with that when it comes to questions of dissemination, especially now when it can be read and misread across lines? But I guess that is something that we all have to be open to. But also this idea of a new discourse around image practices, which I think what all of you are intimating is maybe the realm in which a book can contribute. And it does so because as we think about not identity in terms of regionality, but identity in terms of social formations, maybe the book is also a different kind of formation that allows for us to be emancipated from the regular traditional lines of readability that told us we need to see identity, ourselves, and the other in particular ways. And maybe this is that example of the person coming and sitting there and being able to see one's own experience in a book accounts for something like that. Last of all, of what might have been called therapeutic around image reception is also psychosocial. I mean, this is a very important part of how we sort of read images across the board. But maybe one should not also forget the book is also an object of great fetish, after all. And why not? It has to be seen as something that is extremely personalized and extremely polyphonic. And why not read it also for how attached we get unreasonably to objects from time to time, And because they have great meaning, of course, we want to see them again and again.